Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us for our first keynote today. It's my pleasure to introduce Emily Thomas. Emily is an associate professor at Durham University. She has written extensively on space and time in the history of philosophy, especially from the 17th to the 20th century. She has published in 2018 Absolute Time, Rifts in Early Modern British Metaphysics with Oxford University Press. She has also done plenty of work in recovering the work of historical women philosophers, introducing a few figures to the scholarship. In fact, she has been the editor of a splendid volume on early modern women in metaphysics that we have much benefited from, I think. She has also written a book on the meaning of travel, The Meaning of Travel Philosophers Abroad in 2020 with Oxford University Press. And aside from that, she's been active in outreach, has done lots of radio and popular writing. And finally, quite recently in 2020, she was awarded a Leverhulme Prize. So today, Emily will be talking about perceiving time, specious present theories in mid-18th century England. So please join me to welcome Emily and whenever you want.
Okay, so many thanks to all of you for turning up early this morning after what I hear was quite an adventurous night the night before. Many thanks to Johnny, wherever he is, for organising this fabulous conference. And it's a real pleasure to be here. So, what I am going to be talking to you about is the history of time perception. When I touch something hot, in that immediate instance, what happens? Or when I perceive motion, something going round in a circle, what is it that's actually going on at that time? That's all right. All good. Okay, so lots of philosophical theories have their roots back in the pre-Socratics or the ancient Greeks. They go back at least 2,000 years. That is not the case with the theory known as the specious present. This was said by William James famously in the late 19th century to be the view that the specious present is the short duration of which we are immediately and incessantly sensible. So this is a theory which is less than 150 years old. I'm going to be arguing today that the prehistory of that theory goes back further than 150 years, that it's closer to 250 years. I'll be arguing that the prehistory is missing an interconnected group of philosophers writing on the present in the mid-18th century. The big thesis of this paper that I hope you're all going to agree with is that all four of these figures have interesting things to say about the present and that they deserve a place in the history of the philosophy of thinking about the present. The more minor thesis, which I suspect is going to be controversial, is that I think some of them actually hold specious present theories. So the plan for today is as follows. I'm going to give you some background, talk about what the specious present theory actually is, and talk about the current state of literature on the prehistory. And I'm then going to introduce you to the work of these four figures. And honestly, if any of you have heard of more than one of them, you will be doing very well. They are obscure. I'm then going to be talking about potential lines of influence thinkers might have influenced 19th century specious present theorists. And then I will conclude. So moving on to section 2. I just want to start off by talking about what the specious present is. I know that some of you will be really familiar with this, but I imagine some of you won't be at all. So we can distinguish between the metaphysical present, So we've got the past, the present, and the future. And we normally think about the metaphysical present as being instantaneous, punctate, a mathematical point that separates the past from the future. So that's normally how we think about the present, metaphysically speaking. And we can distinguish that metaphysical present from the experienced present, from the experiential present, as it's sometimes known. And that is what we mean by the specious present. So the specious or experienced present, some people think that it's durationless or punctate, but other people, like William James, think that it has duration. So this is big distinction, metaphysical present versus the present that we experience. Specious present theories carry with them two connotations in the name. So the first is that they are usually concerned with our experience of presentness, that of which we are immediately aware, that which you're aware of right now, is what the specious present is normally thought to be about. The second word, specious, implies that there is something false or deceptive about our experience of the present. Specious present theories come in many, many flavors. And honestly, giving a map of all the specious present theories would be a paper in itself. I'm not going to attempt that here. What I'm going to do is simply outline the mainstream version that most people roughly sign up to, and then an alternative version. I'm going to take both of these versions for simplicity from Robin Lepedvin's great Stanford Encyclopedia article, where he has a section on the specious present. So, on the mainstream conception of the specious present is the duration which is perceived both as present and as extended in time. So the idea is my experienced present feels like it has duration. A really common reason to hold this theory of the specious present is arguments from motion. So here we have a watch. The idea is that we can see the motion of the second hand, but if we can perceive motion, then our perception must take time, because motion is change of place over time, so our perception can't be instantaneous. I'm going to have a slightly more technical slide here. If you're not interested in this, feel free to skip it, but I know there are some of you in the audience who might be really into this. So this is taken from Barry Dainton's excellent Stanford Encyclopedia article, and he distinguishes three main accounts of temporal consciousness. So on the very first account, we have what's known as cinematic theorists. And as the name suggests, they think of temporal perception as something like cinema frames. You can imagine our frames of perception being chopped up like frames on a movie. And for these theorists, they think that our episodes of experiencing and the contents of those episodes are momentary or instantaneous. In contrast, retentionalists say that our episodes of experiencing lack duration. So our episodes of experiencing are durationless, but their contents have temporal extension. So the idea is that somehow in the present moment, I retain the last few moments, and that's how the contents of my experience have duration, even though the episode of experiencing is momentary. Last position, if you're an extensionalist, you pretty straightforwardly think that any episode of experiencing has duration, and that explains how the contents of an episode have duration. This is technical and very quick, and nothing depends on this except that there are going to be a few people in the audience who I suspect really care about this stuff. If you're not one of them, don't worry. But mainstream specious present theorists are either attentionalists or extensionalists. So they agree that the contents of our episodes of experiencing have duration, even if they disagree over whether our episodes of experiencing themselves do. Okay, this brings us on to a non-mainstream account of the specious present, which is also described by Lepedvin. And on this particular account, the idea is that the specious present is the duration which is perceived not as duration, but as instantaneous, that what is in fact taking place at different times is presented as happening in an instant. So the example that you have here is of a TV screen. I didn't know this, but apparently when you look at a TV screen, not all the pixels are illuminated at the same time. It's just that different parts of the screen are illuminated in such quick succession that it appears to us that the whole screen is illuminated at the same time. And for Lepedvin, this is a great example of this kind of theory. It seems as though we are perceiving something instantaneously, but in fact, that seems to accommodate a succession over time. What makes this a specious present theory is the idea that there is something iffy with our perception of the present. There's something deceptive about it. Okay, so as matters stand, here is when people think the specious present theory was invented. It's all in the late 19th century, where people suddenly got really, really interested in temporal reasoning. So we have the likes of Shadworth Hodgson here, writing in 1878. And we then have this guy called Kelly, who was writing under a pseudonym, E.R. Clay. We also have James Ward writing an article called Psychology in Encyclopedia Britannica. And then we have William James, who in 1886 published this really famous article on the perception of time, and he later popularized that in his Principles of Psychology. So as matters stand, people usually credit Hodgson and Kelly as the co-inventors of the specious present theory. I'm very briefly going to tell you a little bit about their theories. So James Ward seems to hold this non-mainstream conception of the specious present that I'm going to nickname the falsely punctual perception. Ward also seems to think that although our present seems to be punctual or momentary, that there's something false about that. In contrast, the other thinkers seem to hold the mainstream conception that the contents of our experienced present that has duration. So here we have Hodgson, and here we have Kelly. There's no picture of Kelly that I can find anywhere. But Kelly very famously made a load of arguments for motion, where he talked about how if we can see the movements of a bird's wing, then our experiencing must have duration. So poor Kelly is now represented by a bird. This will not be the first wrong picture in this presentation. So, okay. Most famously of all, of course, it is William James. And James, when he advances his own theory of the specious present, he cites all three of these people that went before him. James is very generous in his acknowledgements that he didn't invent the specious present, but of course he develops it. And James very famously distinguishes the strict or knife edge present, that's the metaphysical present, from the specious or practically cognized present. This is the present that we experience. And he compares the present that we experience to a saddleback. And he argues that we sit on this saddle and we actually look forwards to the future and backwards to the past. And he thinks that that's how we experience time, that this specious present is an integral part of our time perception. Where James definitely goes beyond the earlier people is that he incorporates the results of experimental psychology on the amount of duration that we can feel. So he's obviously enormously involved with psychology, and he is looking back to various experiments, and he calculates, for example, the minimum amount of duration that we can feel. Okay. When we want to understand the prehistory of these late 19th century theorists, our earliest source is actually William James himself, who talks about John Locke and Thomas Reid in his work. And the existing literature on the prehistory of the specious present clusters around these people. So there's lots of literature on Locke, and then there's a bit on Thomas Reid. As Locke really looms large in the background of the stuff I'm going to be talking about, I will tell you a little bit about what people have thought about Locke. So Locke does not advance a specious present theory, but Locke does advance views on temporal consciousness, which people have read as implying a rejection of the specious present theory or implying that he might accept it. Reasons to think that he might reject it is that he claims we get our idea of duration by reflecting on the distances between our ideas. And you might think that means that he takes our ideas to be durationless. And some people have thought that means he would reject the specious present. There's quite a complicated chain of reasoning by which people go from Locke's text to the interpretation that he would reject it. But really briefly, that's how some people read him. On the other hand, there are some people who think that Locke would welcome a specious present theory because he does tell us there can be motions that are swifter than our ideas. For example, he says, were someone to shoot a bullet through a room, our ideas would not be able to track the course of the bullet. And that implies that maybe he thinks that there are motions too swift for us to perceive, and maybe that could feed into a specious present theory. Regardless of how we want to read Locke on this, and I don't have a vested interest, it's undeniably the case that his views became a kind of backdrop against which later figures are positioning themselves. Aside from Locke, there's some literature on Thomas Reid's memory. Thomas Reid also explicitly rejected the specious present, but what makes him interesting is that he explicitly rejected it. And because, as we know, in the course of explicitly rejecting something, you have to say something about it. And so Holly Anderson and Rick Grush have argued that his remarks on the specious present were then taken up, developed by a whole line of Scottish philosophers, and then made their way into the likes of Shadworth Hodgson and William James. I completely agree with Anderson and Grush. I think that definitely happened. So current state of the literature is like this. We've got our late 19th century specious present theorists, and then we've got Locke and Reid, who say some interesting things about the present, but do not defend specious present theories themselves. The aim of this paper is going to be to convince you that we are missing a big slice of this prehistory in the shape of these four figures: David Hartley, Joseph Priestley, Abraham Tucker, and William Watson. They're all writing between Locke and Reid, and I'm going to be arguing that some of them even hold specious present theories. So what I'm now going to do is tell you a bit about their work. I'm going to start with David Hartley, who wrote this enormous book in 1749 called The Observations on Man. So Hartley was a doctor, and he's actually pretty well studied in the history of psychology and neuroscience, because he's sometimes claimed to be the grandfather of neuroscience, and that is going to be important for this talk. So on Hartley's account of the mind, he agrees with Locke that all our ideas ultimately derive from experience. But he goes way beyond Locke in that he's really interested in the physical processes of how that actually works. So Hartley, as a doctor, he's interested in how when I touch something hot, the nerves flow up my arm, how the nerves connect with the nerves in my brain, and how that stimulates ideas. And on his view, our sensations and our ideas of sensations are vibrations in our nervous systems and in our brains. I should say, in this one sentence, I'm saying something that he says over like 8 chapters because he goes into a tremendous amount of detail about how our nervous system works and how our brainstem works and how our brains work. What's interesting about these sensations is that he explicitly tells us they are really quick. So he refers to sensations and ideas that recur several times in a second. So they're really speedy, these vibrations. And he is explicit that they have duration, which they have to, right? Because a vibration is a motion, and as we know, motions are change of place over time. So for Hartley, a sensation has to have duration. He gives us a few examples of what sensations might be. So he talks about how a sensation might be of warmth or of light or a bit of taste. So that's the kind of level that he is thinking of. Now, in part 1 of this book, he sets out his neuroscience. In part 2 of the book, he investigates various theological issues. And this passage is taken from a bit where he is thinking about how we can increase our happiness. And in this context, he tells us that we have a power of uniting different sensations, and that by uniting different sensations together, we can increase the limits of our present time. He explains that in a metaphysical sense, the present is an indivisible moment. So that is our metaphysical present. But in contrast, in a practical sense, the experienced present is a finite quantity of various magnitudes. So I think uncontroversially here, Hartley is introducing this distinction that's foundational to later theories between the metaphysical present and the present that we experience. I think that is uncontroversial. What is a lot more controversial is whether Hartley is actually offering a specious present theory. And I actually think that he is. Whether or not he is going to turn on how we understand his experienced present. Now, you might think that by the present time in a practical sense, he could be referring to the present week or the present year, in which case that's not a specious present theory, because the present that we're talking about is the immediate present that we experience, not just the present hour. But I think there's a case to be made that he is talking about our immediate present, given that he's talking about sensations. And we know that sensations are really, really quick. So the way I read him is as saying something like, a practical present can encompass one sensation, like the warmth of a coffee mug, and that has a really short duration, maybe a tenth of a second, but we can unite these sensations together, maybe the sensation of warmth and the taste of the coffee. And in doing so, we can extend the duration of our practical present, maybe to like 3/10 of a second. If I'm right about that, then he is offering us a proto-spacious present theory. It's not very well developed, but I think it's there. And it's one that comes direct from his neuroscience. Why does he think that the present we experience have duration? Because he thinks that we experience sensations, and sensations have very short durations. Okay, this is Hartley. Moving on to Priestley. So Priestley loved Hartley, like absolutely loved him, raves about him at every opportunity. He even published an edition of this book, Hartley's Observations. And I think there are a couple of texts where Priestley it may be inclined towards a specious present theory. I don't want to say that he holds one. I don't think the textual evidence is there. But I think certainly he has interesting things to say on the present. So don't bother to read this because we don't have enough time. But what Priestley is doing here it is echoing Hartley's remarks on happiness. The difference, to my mind, between Priestley and Hartley is that Priestley doesn't put these remarks on happiness in the context of sensations and neuroscience. And for that reason, maybe Priestley is taking Hartley's account of the specious present on board, but I'm not sure. The other text that I think is more suggestive is in this essay in 1775 of Complex and Abstract Ideas, where he subverts Locke's account of how we get our idea of duration. So where Locke says we get our idea of duration from reflecting on the distances between our ideas, Priestley says that we get it by reflecting on the duration of our ideas. This is not Lockean, which Priestley would definitely have known, but he just kind of puts this in there regardless. And I think if you are inclined to believe that our ideas have duration, then again, you might well incline towards a specious present theory yourself. Picture of person with eyes closed is because Priestley specifically asks us to imagine looking at something in a room, shutting your eyes, and the way that the idea can linger afterwards. So our ideas have duration. Priestley is going to play an important role later in this story. Okay, moving on. So Abraham Tucker. Have any of you heard of Abraham Tucker? Hands up if you have. Okay, good, well done. I had never heard of him. Like before I began tracking down references between these figures, he was unknown to me. So he is what is known as a gentleman scholar, which sounds rather nice. And although he was familiar with the work of Hartley, I'm pretty sure he came up with his specious present theory independently via reflecting on Locke. I think Tucker straightforwardly holds a specious present theory. I will hang my hat on this. So Tucker tells us the present moment may contain an interval of time, though extremely short. Does this view not stand confirmed by the evidence of our senses in their discernment of motion? So the idea is, if we see a body move, then that perception must take time. And so he says, it follows our acts of immediate perception have a certain duration containing a beginning and an end, both present to us together. The example he uses is this, of a piece of wood on fire being spinned in a circle. I think straightforwardly that this is a specious present theory. And I think that he anticipates later theorists in a couple of really specific ways. So one thing is lots of people have said that Kelly was the first person to argue for the specious present via arguments from motion. I mean, I think pretty clearly Tucker is doing that. Also, this idea that our present perception has a beginning and an end foreshadows in quite interesting ways remarks that are made in Hodgson and also in James. In their excellent paper on Reid and his role in the specious present, Anderson and Grush also say that Reid was the first person to explicitly problematize the temporal content of single perceptual acts. I mean, I also think Tucker is getting there, a good 100 years before. A question that I find really interesting is why Tucker is offering us a specious present theory at all. So his theory comes out in a chapter titled Eternity. And in this chapter, he's talking about divine eternity. And he's contrasting the idea that God's eternity might be timeless with the view that God is eternal by virtue of being in time, existing through all times. And in this chapter, Tucker is talking about the present that we experience. But he's also talking about the metaphysical present. And in that context, he poses this brilliant question. Another question may arise concerning time, why such a particular point of it must be the present. Why might not the whole course of time been anticipated or retarded? So why isn't it the case that now is now? Couldn't time have been sped up or slowed down? If some of you are thinking that this sounds quite suspiciously similar to Craig Bourne's more recent paper, why is it now? Yes, I agree. Definitely. So what on earth is Tucker doing in this chapter? Why is it that he's connecting the metaphysical and the specious present with divine eternity? I don't have the time to explain to you the reasoning behind this reading, so I'm just going to tell you what I think. I think that what Tucker is doing is using these positions as objections to the timeless view of eternity. So he's saying, why is now? Well, because God is in time, and God's presence in time fixes what moment is present, and that the nature of God's existence ensures that the present moment proceeds at a steady pace. As for the specious present, this gives Tucker a way of denying that we should think about eternity as a point, as a punctum stans, as some people put it. He wants to say that our experienced present has duration, and so does God's. And this is weird. It's weird and cool, in my view. And I think that what Tucker is doing here is describing this feature of human temporal experience, and he is using that to make a case about the nature of God. I actually think that he does this at various other points in the text as well, that it's part of a wider pattern of reasoning. Okay, this brings us on to our fourth figure, William Watson, who I'm certain you will not have heard of because there is no literature on him whatsoever. This is not even a picture of William Watson. It is a picture of his father. And this is as close as I could get. So this is what we have. Even though Watson is not known today at all, he was a big figure back in the day. So he was a member of the Royal Society. He later became Mayor of Bath, and he did lots and lots of science. So he wrote things on botany, astronomy, geology, and interestingly for us, he was best friends with astronomer William Herschel, and there's this really sweet remark from Herschel that I'm going to read to you because I think it's just great, where Herschel says, in a paper where they are studying the height of hills, the Dr. Watson, ever ready in the cause of philosophical pursuits, assisted at the execution. Right, so the two of them did a lot of things together. Watson, importantly, was also really good friends with Priestley. Priestley lived very close to Bath during this point of time. So Priestley, Watson, and Herschel are all collaborating together on various different things. Okay, so Watson publishes in 1785 a treatise on time. And in this treatise, he actually says in the preface that he would never have published it except that Priestley approved it. And he also dedicates the book to Herschel, saying that it comes very close to your dearest love, astronomy. All of this is going to be important. In this book, Watson references all the people we've been looking at previously, so Hartley and Priestley and Tucker. And this is part of what makes me think there's a real group here of people reading each other on the present. So to understand Watson's views on the present, I need to say a little bit about his view of perception more generally. So he distinguishes between durable perceptions, like hearing thunder that rolls on, or instantaneous perceptions, like a lightning flash. It's come and gone, it's instant. And he tells us that whatever instantaneous perception is the immediate object of our attention, that's what we can consider to be present. Okay. So, in the treatise, Watson offers us three notions of time. So we have perceptible time, a notion that we acquire by observing the flux of our instantaneous perceptions. We then have universal time, and this is when we think about our flux of perceptions is being represented by the motions of heavenly bodies. This is actually pretty similar to Locke's straightforward notion of time, if any of you know about that. And finally, this is what's really interesting to us. He says that we have a notion of imperceptible time, and we acquire this when we consider any portion of universal time as being divisible into parts that represent a quicker flow of perceptions than any we ever experience. I just have to say this last bit, even though it's not relevant. Watson definitely thinks that time is unreal and it's just an idea that we have in our heads. And if any of you want to ask me about that in the Q&A, I think it's a really cool view. Okay. Watson, I think, holds a falsely punctual, so non-mainstream account of the specious present. And here's how he gets to it. So he's thinking about astronomy. Let's say how quickly the moon moves around the Earth. And he thought back then that the moon traverses about 4,000 feet per second. Watson infers from this that then 1 second of time is divisible into 4,000 parts. But clearly we can't perceive 1/4,000th of a second. That's just not something that we can do. This leads him to reason that just as there are motions too quick for us to perceive, so also there are times too quick for us to perceive. And consequently, he thinks that the shortest, seemingly instantaneous present must really have duration. So that lightning flash, even though it seems instantaneous, must actually be made up of ever so great a number of inconceivably small portions of imperceptible time. So even though it feels instantaneous, there's something iffy with that. It has duration. And that is why I think he is holding a falsely punctual view of the specious present. Now, our previous three theorists Hartley, Priestley, Tucker don't conduct any experiments on the specious present or on temporal perception. It's just not something that they do. In contrast, Watson, the scientist, ever ready in the cause of philosophical pursuits, he does conduct some experiments, and he does them together with Herschel. And they do things like spinning a wheel really fast and trying to figure out at what point they stop hearing it click. The history of experimental psychology usually records that these experiments began in the 1850s. But that is clearly not the case. These guys were explicitly doing it back in the late 18th century. And their results are surprisingly similar. I was surprised, anyway, to the results that the mid 19th century theorists are getting. So, for example, Sigmund Exner, and he's one of the experimental psychologists used by William James. He thinks that the minimum amount of duration we can perceive is 2 milliseconds. Watson and Herschel argue that it's 3.1 milliseconds. It's pretty close. Their interest in all of this, I think fairly obviously, stems from astronomy. So there is a wonderful history of microtime. It's called A Tenth of a Second. It's written by Jemina Canales. And she argues that people began getting interested in microtime, in these really short lengths of time, in 1796. And what happened was that we have the royal astronomer, Neville Maskelyne. He fires his assistant because his assistant is tracking the way that objects traverse across his telescope differently than Maskelyne does. And the differences were as much as a tenth of a second. And this worries about how good we are at recording short lengths of time, Canales argues, eventually led to people in the 1850s conducting experiments on it. Now, Maskelyne actually worked with Watson and Herschel. So it seems to me that these kinds of worries might well have been what motivated Watson to think about what we can perceive. That said, I think there are parallel difficulties in another discipline altogether. So Priestley wrote this hugely popular history of electricity in 1767. And in this history, he describes experiments by Watson Sr., where they're trying to measure the speed of electricity, and they can't manage it. The electricity is too fast. And I think that they must have been aware from this then that there are times too small for humans to perceive. So most obviously, Watson's interest comes from astronomy, but I think it might also be powered by this new science of electricity. Okay, we're moving on, final parts of the talk. So I want to say a little bit about how these mid-18th century thinkers might have influenced the later 19th century ones. There are some very broad routes by which their work might have been picked up. So Hodgson does reference Hartley, describing him as a thoroughgoing physiological psychologist. Kelly and Ward also reference Hartley, because even though Hartley isn't that well known today, he was a real giant back then. Priestley in general was widely read, but I haven't found any evidence that this particular text was read by any of the later thinkers on the present. Hodgson critiques a different part of Tucker's book at length. There's like a whole chapter on it. And that makes me think that if Hodgson read that part of Tucker, that he would also have read the part of Tucker on time. Given that Hodgson was totally obsessed with time, I don't think that is an implausible inference. Watson's treatise on time was actually featured really prominently in a Britannica encyclopedia article, and that was reprinted across 4 different editions. I find it interesting that Watson, I think, is advancing this falsely punctual notion of the specious present. James Ward, in the 9th or 10th edition, is also advocating a falsely punctual account of the specious present. I think that's suggestive. Aside from these very broad routes, I want to make a more concrete case that Hodgson read Hartley. So there are 2 common elements that I find to be quite significant. The first is this distinction between the metaphysical present and the experienced present. I think we do find that straightforwardly in Hartley, and Hodgson very famously advances it as well. And it seems to me that is that's quite striking. The idea that Hodgson picked this up from Hartley, I think, isn't beyond the pale. The other big commonality I find between them is that Hartley has this account of how God is present to all events. And effectively, Hartley says, God has a universe-wide specious present. So how is everything present to God? Because everything is contained in this gigantic specious present. And so he tells us that all time, whether past, present, or future, is present time in the eye of God. And that's because time is a relative thing, belonging to beings of finite capacities and varying with them. So my specious present is really, really short, but I can increase it a little bit. And God, a being of infinite capacities, can increase it to infinity. You might think this is a peculiar idea, and I don't disagree. But not only is it found in Hodgson, it's also found in Josiah Royce, Mary Calkins, as we heard about yesterday, and arguably even Bergson. So this is definitely an idea that sounds strange, but quite a lot of people have found it to be an attractive account of understanding God's divine eternity. I find it also interesting that Hodgson, in his view of this, uses quite similar language. So he's also talking about capacities, and he's, describing human beings as finite. I mean, the language, it's not unmistakable, but there are similarities there that make me think, again, maybe Hodgson was reading Hartley. Okay, so to sum up then, regardless of whether these figures had any subsequent influence, maybe Hodgson did just reinvent all these ideas from Hartley, whether they had any subsequent influence at all, I think that they all held views that are really important to the history of reasoning on the present, of temporal consciousness more generally, and that they should be recognized as such. What's more, I think that arguably Hartley, definitely Tucker, and Watson, it actually held specious present theories, well over 100 years before the specious present theory was supposed to have been invented. And as we've seen, the Watson-Herschel experiments, they push this history of microtime backwards by a good 70 years. I think, given the enormous admiration that Hartley and Tucker and Watson held for Locke, that their theories of the specious present are really inspired by reflecting on the issues that Locke raised. I think that Locke is the source of this. That's not the case in Priestley, because I think Priestley just loved Hartley, and Hartley is the source of most things in Priestley. Okay, so all 4 of these thinkers deserve a place in the history of temporal consciousness, and here they are, stuck in, including Watson's father. Thank you very much.
splendid talk. So questions, leave your hand up for a second. Okay, so Tony.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. It was fascinating. This is a very uninformed and clarificatory question. Yeah, I was wondering regarding Watson. You said that he believed at the time. Oh, thank you. Thank you. So this is a clarificatory question regarding Watson. And you said that he didn't believe that time exists, that it is an invention. But he's talking about experience time then. But nevertheless, he thinks that a species present is somehow constituted by moments of time that we don't experience. So I was wondering if there's a tension there. How can he talk about inexperienced time if he doesn't believe that time is something outside our minds?
Okay, thank you. Watson is, I think, that there's this unusual tradition that has its roots in Edmund Law in the 1730s, where Law is kind of a Leibnizian relationist. So he thinks that motions and change exist, but he doesn't want to say that time is anything above and beyond that. However, where Leibniz talks about relations, Law argues that our idea of time is abstracted via a Lockean process of abstraction from these successions and motions and changes. And so for Law, time is just an abstract idea in our minds. What really exists are the motions and things in the world. And Watson just does that. In a more complicated way than Law, but that's the conclusion that he ends up with. Interestingly, so Jonathan Ray has argued that Priestley is the source of Watson's metaphysic of time in this idea. I have no idea why. I've asked Ray, and he says he had sources, but he can't find them. Which is very frustrating. But if that's true, that would that would put a whole different, whole new angle on this.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Alex.
Thanks so much. It's really great to hear about these guys. This idea that you find in Hartley and Hodgson of God experiencing all of time from a kind of specious present seems sort of like a modern version of the medieval Nunkstands kind of idea of God experiencing all of time from, a single now. But I was thinking Hobbes, who these guys maybe read, makes this point at some point, somewhere in the Leviathan, I think, that it's weird that the scholastics want to say that God experiences all of time from a single now, but not that they don't have a Higgs stance. They don't think that God experiences all of space in a single place. I just wondered whether that had come up.
No is the short answer. I agree with you. It feels like it should. What I can say about that is, so today we space-time parallel reason all the time. Back then it was just less common. People quite often treated them in different ways. And it's a really nice idea. It's just not something that comes up in that way, that they treat them differently. But
Just wondering.
thank you. No, I like that. To say a bit more, so Hartley is talking about this distinction between the present in the context of discussing happiness. He's not giving us a metaphysic of time. It's kind of coming up incidentally in another topic. And maybe that's also why. Maybe if he was actually giving us a metaphysic, here's what time and space are, that he'd be much more inclined to parallel reason. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a really fascinating talk. And actually, what you've just said leads into my question, because I was really struck by the fact that it came up in the context of talking about happiness for Hartley, partly because I've been thinking a lot about ancient views about happiness and time. So here are two ways. So a lot of the Hellenistic philosophers, I think, worried about the relation between happiness and time. And here are two kinds of worry that I think might be relevant. So one is if you're a hedonist, do you think that happiness is pleasure? Then you must think that to be happy at tea, you must be enjoying at tea. And so then the question is, how can your life as a whole be happy? And I think the Epicureans were inclined to say, well, you can enjoy the whole of your life at a time by using memory and anticipation. And that sounded quite similar to the sort of thought that Hartley was saying. And then I think there's also stuff in Marcus Aurelius. So he's a Stoic, but so the thought is there's some sense in which what's present is what depends on us. So what you should care about is what's present. But then I think there is a thought that, well, then the present can't just be an instant. So, and then maybe it's a sort of variable length. So I wondered, so firstly, I thought there might be an interesting ancient prehistory to this. And then also I wondered especially about Hartley, because it came up in the context of happiness, whether there was any possibility that he knew about those ancient discussions.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I was unaware of this ancient prehistory. I don't know whether Hartley was aware or not. He read widely, but it's not stuff that he cites. I can tell you, yeah, I can say that. Hartley is talking about happiness in the context of thinking about the problem of evil. So he is asking, how can we be happy given that there's suffering in the world? And his answer is, oh, well, when we understand things better, then we can see the good in them, and that allows us to be happier. And that's why God, who understands everything, is perfectly happy. On my reading of him as a specious present theorist, I think that is the bit you could put pressure on, because you could say something like, well, if he's talking about understanding, like causes and how they lead to what appear to be random acts of evil, but are in fact parts of the grand plan, then that doesn't sound very much like the immediate present experience that you need for the specious present. To which I'm going to say, that's true, but then there's all this technical language about sensations. I don't think my reading of Hartley is foolproof for exactly this reason. And perhaps if there is a tradition, an ancient tradition that's talking about understanding causes, then maybe that would add grist to the other side. Except as you're saying that if Aurelius also thinks the present needs to be longer, that might help me. Thanks, that's really interesting. And now I want to go away and read that stuff.
I'll send you the...
Yeah, please do. Thank you.
Okay, we have a few questions, so let's be concise if we can. So we have one here.
Thank you so much. My question was about, do you think that any of the four that you mentioned, or like anyone who worked in the perception of time, took what they thought about perception of time to influence the metaphysics of time as well? Because you said there was a very stark distinction and people were very explicit about it. But I would imagine that at least somewhere, and it's not very implausible to think that, oh, if I kind of start off by saying that there is this distinction between the metaphysical present, which is sharp and knife-edged, and this spacious present. But if I want to say that, oh, the content and maybe the duration is also a kind of extended at time, then it's maybe not too big of a step to say that, oh, maybe the metaphysical time is also extended, and maybe you can get some like proto A theory, B theory stuff going on as well. So I was just wondering whether there were these connections made, whether people thought that their theories of consciousness of time could influence the metaphysics of time as well, or was it just two separate things, people didn't connect them?
Thank you very much. Obviously, I'm really interested in metaphysics, so this is a good question. In Hartley and Priestley, they say really nothing about the metaphysics of time, just not their concern, I think. I have views, but they really don't say anything. Tucker does say things. So I'm pretty sure Tucker is a presentist, but he really doesn't give us a full-blown metaphysic of time. It's rather he makes disconnected statements in the course of talking about other things. And this chapter on eternity is really about how humans perceive time, and then what that tells us about the nature of God. So the metaphysics of time is just never squarely his focus. Watson, on the other hand, absolutely. So the bulk of the book is setting out these three notions of time. The experience, the universal, and then the imperceptible. And then the crowning chapter of the book is using all of this to show, hey, all we know of time are these three notions, and that gives us reason to say that notions are nothing but creatures of the understanding, and so time doesn't exist except as an idea in our minds. So Watson very much wants to give us a metaphysic and to use his reasoning on this stuff to feed into it, but the others don't. And actually, in fact, in literature and perception of time today, it tends to be fairly divorced from metaphysics. There aren't that many people working on how we experience time and the metaphysics of time. It tends to be one or the other.
So all the way there, we have Peter.
There we go. Thanks, Emily. So this timeline is helpful for my question. I guess, so given that the specious present is meant to be a part of our immediate perceptual experience, why doesn't the discussion of it go much further back? Like, why does it, because this discussion is about where you can pinpoint the beginning of it. So yeah, why isn't it like our perception of colors or something that just goes all the way back?
That's a really good question, and I'm just not sure. Locke definitely is the person who kicks this stuff off, not by talking about the specious present, but Locke frames these issues by pondering motion. So famously, there's this debate in the Locke literature when Locke is talking about space and time. Is he talking metaphysics, or is he talking about our ideas of space and time? And I'm one of the people who reads him as saying, I'm talking about ideas, not the metaphysical entities. And in talking about ideas, he's then asking, well, how do we get these ideas of space and time? And I think that leads him to reflect on the sources, and then motion is a really obvious source for how we get our ideas of time. And that leads him to say, there can be these motions like the bullet that's too swift for us to perceive. He also thinks there are motions that are too long for us to perceive. There are motions that are so slow we can't see the things that are in motion. And he really doesn't take it any further than that, I think, although there are some scholars who've argued differently. But then I think it's reading Locke that these people are then led to reflecting on, but if we only reflect on motion this way, like what does it mean? And in Hartley's case, he's not reflecting on motion. Hartley just has a philosophy of mind, a metaphysic of mind, where motion is built in. If you think an idea is literally a vibration in the brain, then motion is built into that. So I think it all starts with Locke and how we gain our ideas of space and time. And I don't have the sense that question was big before Locke. Like buckets of metaphysics of time before that, but not much on how we get our idea of it. Maybe there are medieval scholars here who can tell me that I'm wrong about that. but that's my sense of it, that Locke made that a big question.
So last row, we have Johnny.
Thank you very much for that. It was very insightful and interesting.
Sorry, I think if we follow the order, it's Johnny's turn.
Hey, am I audible? Oh, great. Emily, thanks so much. This was absolutely terrific. I really enjoyed it. So just a suggested addition to your timeline is that I think that Hume holds the falsely punctual view in 1739. But it's not clear to me that the falsely punctual view deserves to be classified as a specious present theory. They seem sort of opposites of each other and to be motivated by opposite kinds of example. Right, so the specious present, Lepoitvin defines it as the duration which is perceived both as present and as extended. Whereas on the falsely punctual view, there's something which is in fact extended, but we perceive it as instantaneous. So they seem to have sort of they seem to attribute opposite representational contents to our experience of the present. And then they're motivated by different kinds of cases, I think, because the specious present theory is motivated by experience as of motion, whereas the falsely punctual theory seems to be motivated by cases where there is something which actually is moving, but we experience it as static because our perceptual experience can't keep up with the motion that there really is in the world. So why, what is it that sort of led you to classify those together?
Okay, fantastic. This is precisely why I included that technical slide at the beginning about the contrast between cinematic retentionalists and extensionalists. This is why it's in there. Okay, let me start off by saying this. I personally haven't classified the falsely punctual view as a specious present theorist. That's been done by earlier people in the literature. So that is done by Robin Lepoitvin, and also there's other people who write about this. Sean Power, for example, he has a categorization of specious present theories. So I am borrowing on them. Nonetheless, this is very important because I agree with you. I think there is a case to be made that the falsely punctual view is not a specious present theory, for exactly the reasons that you've given. It seems to just be doing a different thing. So I've been trying to think, I mean, Robin Lepoitvin, it's a clever guy. Like, why is it that he's including this amongst the specious present theories? And here is my view. He doesn't say this, but this is what I think. So the retentionalists and the extensionalists both agree that the contents of our present experience have duration, and they're just disagreeing over whether our episodes of experiencing do. And then on the face of it, the cinematic theorist is saying neither do. Now, the falsely punctual theorist does not seem to me to be a cinematic theorist. What it seems to me they're saying is, oh, it looks like the cinematic theory is true, but actually there's something wrong with it. And they're not diagnosing what's wrong with it. But presumably they are saying, given the TV example, either our episodes of experiencing actually do have duration, even though they don't seem to, or they're saying, the contents of our episodes actually have duration, even though maybe the episodes themselves don't. So it seems to me that they're saying it looks like the cinematic theory is true, but actually, really retentionalism or extensionalism is. And I think that is the only way to make sense of it. But if that is the case, then I think Lepoitvin and others are right to categorize it as a specious present view, even though it's motivated in completely different ways. It's not clear. Lepoitvin seems to kind of endorse it in some really early work. And then he definitely does an about turn by the 2019 article and does not seem to endorse it anymore. But James Ward, for what it's worth, I think straightforwardly says this. So James Ward, in that 1880s encyclopedia article, he says that we perceive a series of events, A, B, C, D, E, and we perceive them as simultaneous, even though they are a series and therefore must have duration. And again, he doesn't quite say what's going on, but it seems to me that this is very much the same claim. It seems as though we perceive things cinemagraphically, but actually it's not. Actually, it's extensionalist or attentionalist. Has that persuaded you? Sorry, no, we probably have a huge queue.
I won't. I'd love to hear more about it. It's not totally clear to me why a cinematic theorist can't be a falsely punctual theorist. But
okay.
There's a bunch of questions, and I think we might actually have time for one more.
We should move on. Yeah, let's go. I'm just gonna go, if that's okay, over like 3 minutes, and we start with like 3 or 4 minutes later.
Hi, I'll keep them quick. I have two questions. The first is Augustine in Book 11 of his Confessiones describes how we are able to perceive maybe music or an event as occurring or unfolding over time, and that they are constituted by the past and the future. So why doesn't his view count as a spacious present theory? And then the second question is more speculative. Is Newton involved in any aspect of the more contemporary, more modern thinkers? Because Newton, of course, differentiates between absolute time and time that we can, dynamic time that we perceive. And then the emergence of calculus allows us to think about time as infinitely divisible. So that kind of notion of time versus how we perceive time must have influenced, I think, some of these thinkers, particularly Hartley, who I think talks about the sensorium to describe how we acquire stimuli. And of course, Newton describes the universe as a sensorium of God.
Okay, thank you very much. So on the first question, yes, Augustine, clearly very important in the history of reasoning about the present, but Augustine does not explicitly distinguish between the metaphysical present and the experienced present. You might want to argue that it's inferred in some way in the way that people have done about Locke, but that's why he's not straightforwardly part of this history. With regards to Newton, I completely agree with you. Hartley loved Newton. But I'm not sure that Newton does distinguish between absolute time and then the motion that we perceive. I'm just not sure that's something that he does. I mean, of course, Newton would say, oh, we can't perceive absolute time. We have to argue, we just kind of have to presuppose that it's there because that's how we make sense of absolute motion. But I don't think he's really not interested in our perception of time, I think.
So we only have time for one more question. I'm very sorry. Sorry, Michael. Yeah, sorry about that.
Oh, no, it's fine, it's fine. Well, Mike? Oh, stand right there. Is that, yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. That was really cool. I have a sort of a simple question about whether any of these people distinguish between the idea that the present is unextended and that it's indivisible, right? Because in most cases, those two kind of, one implies the other. If something is extended, that means it's got parts. If it's got parts, it means you can divide it into parts. But arguably, the God stuff is quite interesting here because God is the one exception to this, right? There are some people who want to say that God is extended in a way, that he doesn't have the kind of static existence that you would associate with the forms or something of that sort. But you do not want God to be divisible because God is simple. And I wonder whether because for example, the quotes that you gave, they seem to use these interchangeably, but there seems to be a difference there. I was wondering whether any of these distinguish them.
Yeah. I like that. You're right. Unextended need not mean the same as like conceptually indivisible, say. But when it comes to talking about the metaphysical present, actually what they tend to do is just chuck a load of adjectives to it. I think by way of saying it's a mathematical point and that's all I mean. And I think that's what they're doing when they're saying that it's not extended and it's indivisible. I think they really just want to carve out this notion of a punctate mathematical point, and that's it. And they don't say any more than that. They certainly would when they're talking about God, but when they're talking about the metaphysical present, that's it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Emily, and thanks everyone for the questions.